When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come.
Aw, it's Jiminy. Nostalgia. So normally, before I try to give something a feminist analysis, I look to see what other feminists have written about it. With Disney, I imagined that this would be really easy. I see stuff all the time about Snow White or The Little Mermaid. However, as it turns out, feminists have written almost nothing about Pinocchio, and it's easy to see why. Pinocchio is heavily male-focused, with the only female characters being the Blue Fairy and Cleo the goldfish. Pretty much the only comment feminists have ever made on it is that there should be more active female characters, because that pretty much is the only thing that feminists can comment on. I'll try to be a little more involved than that, but because there is such a masculine focus, I'm going to comment on things more peripheral to feminist values than I usually would. Released in 1940, Pinocchio is the second Disney animated film, following 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It is based on the 1883 Italian children's novel The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi, about a living marionette terrorizing his poor carpenter father Geppetto in the manner of disobedient young boys. The book reminds me of Grimm's fairy tales in its fantastical depiction of the pitfalls of growing up, with morals hammered in multiple times. The book is kind of about living in poverty and teaching young boys the values they need to succeed in that environment. Pinocchio comes into the world as a bad kid. He is disobedient, mean, lazy, prideful, thieving, and gullible. He's kind of a cross between Veruca from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and Sid from Toy Story. This Pinocchio is not a nice guy, and he continually gets burned for it. With the guidance of authority figures, he slowly learns how to be a good kid in the author's view, and successful as a result. It's strict capitalistic authoritarianism, and just plain mean-spirited. The Disney movie continues the theme of teaching young boys discipline, with a far more likable Pinocchio, who's more just a little naive than a little punk like he is in the book. At the same time, it removes a lot of the lessons, and mostly makes it about going to school, not being gullible, and not falling in with a bad crowd. There's also a whole theme about faith added to the story, and there is more of a focus on the good friends and family. The movie starts with an anthropomorphized cricket named Jiminy Cricket singing "When You Wish Upon a Star, Your Dreams Come True," which would later become Disney's theme song, and kind of their version of The Secret. He turns out to be our narrator for the story. Probably for the best, given that the book is just a bunch of random encounters, and having a main character narrate helps thread everything together. His name is a joke. These days, when people think Jiminy Cricket, they think this character. Actually, his name is a joke. Something that people would shout in place of Jesus Christ.
Jiminy Crickets.
The modern equivalent might be naming an anthropomorphic cheese block Cheese and Rice. Even though he's just a little cricket, he's a respectable older male figure, and I find him extremely likable. I'm not sure I'd call him naturally fatherly, but he's got lived experience to give him character and wisdom. Given that his dialect fits the 1940s era, he comes off as a bit more grandfatherly today than he would have back then, where his voice would just make him sound like a charismatic adult. Maybe imagine him being voiced by Nathan Fillion.
You don't know me, son, so let me explain this to you once. If I ever kill you, you'll be awake, you'll be facing me, and you'll be armed.
As he tells the story, we see how he used to be a wandering vagabond. One cold night, he sneaks into a house to warm himself by the fire. Immediately, this makes Disney's Pinocchio less harsh towards the disenfranchised than the book. It's interesting because Walt Disney has a reputation for having been extremely hard on the poor. This just goes to show that there's a spectrum. The house belongs to the carpenter Geppetto, a kindly old man living with a masculine cat named Figaro and a feminine goldfish named Cleo. It's interesting to have a single cat be male, as cats are often gendered as female due to associations of graceful movements. On the other hand, the goldfish is done up to evoke the opulence and grace of upper-class femininity, which we see more of with the goldfishes in Fantasia, which was being made at the same time as Pinocchio. The two animals display traditional gender roles, with Figaro being very active and involved in the scenes, while Cleo just swims around in her little bowl and looks pretty. I get the sense that Figaro was used as a way to show off Disney animation with realistic cat movements, and that sends this active male character front and center. Cleo looks like a fish, but she just looks pretty while passively sitting in her bowl, and is certainly less interesting. While we do expect a cat to move around and a fish to stay put, these characters needn't even exist like that. The book didn't even have these characters, and the characters it did have were massively changed for better storytelling. Disney had these two characters be made just like this, and that's worth criticism. Cleo doesn't have to be a fish, she could be another cat. Even as a fish, the laws of reality could be bent to allow her to be more active. Pinocchio will make us accept some pretty weird stuff. Figaro has the character of a 10-year-old boy. I initially thought that Cleo was supposed to be an adult woman, but she and Figaro are love interests, so maybe it's just that back then there wasn't a big distinction between the roles of little girls and adult women. That could also explain the Snow White dwarf attraction. Ugh. Jiminy Cricket observes the quaint carpenter's house. Geppetto spent a long time building music boxes, dolls, and clocks. Geppetto is also working on a puppet of a nice little boy, which he decides to name Pinocchio, despite Figaro and Cleo thinking that it's a weird name. This won't be the only joke about Pinocchio's name. Along with the anachronistic Jiminy Cricket, it's a way of altering the original story to make it more acceptable to the contemporary American viewers, in a similar vein of American raccoons showing up in the German setting of Snow White. As Geppetto finishes up the paint, Jiminy rests his hand on a statue that he realizes too late to represent the rear end of a woman. He reacts like he committed a real faux pas, and like a gentleman, he blushingly apologizes. I'm going to complain about him later, so I just want to acknowledge that this is handled well. As Geppetto finishes playing with his pets, a bunch of novelty clocks go off to announce that it's 9 o'clock. Geppetto seems like one step away from inventing a flux capacitor.
88 miles per hour!
He's got a ton of clocks, and they play novelty scenes with mechanical figures. You've got ducks, you've got hatching birds, you've got a racist Indian man on an elephant, and you've got a mother spanking a naughty son. Pinocchio is definitely a didactic story, and this clock seems thematic. It's problematic because spanking and other forms of corporal punishment are abusive. I understand that it was acceptable back then and is at least controversial now, but it doesn't matter to me. It's abusive and Disney should not normalize it. End of story. Geppetto settles down to bed and everyone joins him. But he makes Figaro open the window and then sees the wishing star. He holds his hands together and wishes that Pinocchio would be a real boy. Jiminy appreciates the sentiment but doubts that it would ever happen. However, after everyone else goes to sleep, the Blue Fairy appears to grant Geppetto's wish. Now in the book, the Blue Fairy, they're called the girl with the turquoise hair, is a powerful figure just existing in the world, who takes an interest in Pinocchio and helps him out from time to time as a sister and maternal figure. I would compare her to a magical character from Lord of the Rings. Powerful but limited, and comparable to a human ruler. In the movie, she's basically a Christian angel. The wishing star is basically symbolic of God, and Geppetto basically prays to him, and then an angelic figure comes down from the heavens to grant this prayer. Even though no one says God, she comes because he prays, and she is a representative of natural order. She's also hot. This isn't something I picked up on as a kid, but she's supposed to be very sexually attractive. She's a blonde-haired beauty with bright red lips that she mostly keeps open in a big smile, like a more mature version of Snow White. Over the decades, animation pushed the boundaries of sexualization so much that she just doesn't look like a sexy lady to us. We expect different sexual coding, so it's hard to really see the Blue Fairy as hot, but she would have been to audiences of 1940. Just imagine that the Blue Fairy looks like Cortana.
She's a hottie. She's blue, but she's a hottie.
Jiminy shows his appreciation by making it sound like he's enjoying food. Given that he's our guide for the story, it comes across as an invitation to objectify women.
You just made a yummy sound, so I thought you'd like the dessert.
I think comparing beautiful women to food was more acceptable before second-wave feminism got into its stride in the 1970s. The 1968 children's film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang presents the lost Bond girl named Truly Scrumptious as a wonderful name for a beautiful woman. It's not quite as gentlemanly as Jiminy was acting earlier. So this hot, sexy fairy animates Pinocchio and gives him an opportunity to become a real boy. However, he is completely naive and doesn't stand a chance if he doesn't get some guidance. Jiminy shows himself to offer Pinocchio some, and through a misunderstanding, the idea comes up that he could become Pinocchio's conscience, or his mentor. The Blue Fairy offers him that duty, and she's so hot that he can't refuse. Seems like a bit of a weakness. She could ask him for anything. Do you want to kill the Dark Lord Sauron?
Uh-huh.
She then knights him, and his clothing becomes classier. Upon receiving this free makeover, he then asks for a gold badge. Not too grateful, are you, Mr. Conscience? What kind of message is that? Seriously, asking a favor from a magical being after they already gave you something for nothing is a good way to get turned into a stump or something. The Blue Fairy has power, but she doesn't have a lot of active agency to make her much more than a humanoid messenger of God. I hope people understand what I mean when I talk about God and angels. It's not so much about religion as it is about natural order of the world. The Blue Fairy grants Geppetto's wish and talks about rules of the world, and that's all she actively does as a character. She could be considered the angelic version of the demonic magic mirror from Snow White. All the magic mirror is a tool of the evil queen that answers questions while looking scary. The Blue Fairy is likewise just an extension of God, the natural order, there to allow the effects of the wish to have a chance to succeed, and she describes rules of the world while looking pretty. While I could see a subordinate magic mirror type of character being okay in a movie, it only works if it complements a more active cast. That exists in Snow White, but in Pinocchio, the subordinate Blue Fairy and Cleo characters are the only female characters we get, and that's annoying. More than just the passivity is the objectification. The Blue Fairy looks hot. She just stays there looking pretty more than actually doing anything, even the subordinate job that she has. There are a lot of pauses in her dialogue just to allow more time to admire her face. Jiminy is ogling her, and the audience is encouraged to ogle her too. Like with Cleo, she mostly just sits there and looks pretty, and this is the main way we are to appreciate her. She and Cleo may not be the fairest in the land, but they get the same treatment as Snow White, where they ornament a scene for the male gaze to admire. The Blue Fairy tells Pinocchio to always let his conscience be his guide, and she vanishes. And, well, most feminists would just stop talking. I would like to do a full review though, so here we go. Jiminy tries to lecture Pinocchio on knowing right and wrong, but Jiminy is not a good lecturer, and Pinocchio has literally zero experience with the world, so they just agree to have Pinocchio call Jiminy with a whistle or shout whenever he's confused. Pinocchio ends up causing a big racket, waking up Geppetto, who thinks there's a burglar and takes out a gun. Yeah, there's some values dissonance.
Say hello to my little friend!
Geppetto gets startled and the gun even goes off. You ever hear of gun safety, Geppetto? Never have your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. Geppetto meets Pinocchio, hears about the Blue Fairy, and celebrates his new son. If anything, I like the non-conventional family dynamics. He's an old man with a young son, there never was a mother, and Pinocchio has a father figure friend in Jiminy Cricket. The nuclear family model is not seen as an unachieved ideal. It's not even present. It's not adoption exactly, but it's good for adoptive families, for presenting a non-conventional family that works in every way. It's also worth considering that the potential future Disney movies with proper gay characters could present similar family dynamics to what's seen in Pinocchio, with the two father figures. Pinocchio almost burns himself to death, and Geppetto has to save him. The kid's naivety really makes him vulnerable. Despite Pinocchio's crippling ignorance, Geppetto sends him off to school on his own. Bad idea. If Geppetto just walked him to school, he'd be a real boy by day end. But no. Pinocchio runs into a couple of swindlers, Honest John and Gideon. Honest John convinces Pinocchio that he'd be great as an actor in Stromboli's puppet show, so that Honest John could sell Pinocchio to him. Yeah, he's in the slave trade. Awesome. Jiminy overslept and is late to arrive on the scene. He tells Pinocchio that becoming an actor is irresponsible, and he should just go to school. In the book, the point is that his studies would help him get a secure career, as opposed to the uncertain life of an actor. And while that implication is still there, I don't think it's focused on enough. Most of the focus is on the overarching danger of Pinocchio being sold into slavery, which Jiminy doesn't see because he's focused on an unstable acting career. And Pinocchio is just completely naive and easily led by the charismatic swindlers. Jiminy gives sound advice that Pinocchio doesn't understand, and Pinocchio goes with the swindlers. He joins Stromboli's puppet show and does a musical number that demonstrates both his amazing ability to move without strings, and Disney's amazing animation talents, and he sings a song that will be delightfully twisted for Age of Ultron.
There are no strings on me.
At one point, real puppets that represent dancing girls are used, and Jiminy finds them hot. It's a joke because Jiminy is a cricket and the girls are puppets, which makes 2 levels of unrealism, but the joke is symbolic of the real practice of women being put on display for men's enjoyment, as with the super hot Blue Fairy being put on display for the male audience. Pinocchio is showered with coins, and Jiminy thinks that he was wrong, and Pinocchio has found a stable acting career, so he decides to retire. I think this lesson is a bit flawed because the danger is only in this unknown slavery conspiracy, not whether or not acting is a sustainable career. As far as we see, Pinocchio could make it as an actor. He fits a niche and people will pay him for his entertainment. This isn't an argument for school, it's an argument against slavery. Stromboli takes all of Pinocchio's money and only pays him 1 counterfeit coin. When Pinocchio tries to leave, he stuffs him in a birdcage and threatens to turn him into firewood. The book's description of Stromboli is of an almost demonic-looking figure with a black beard and fiery red eyes. This translates into the design a bit, but he's mostly just a distinctive human. I think he counts as an example of Disney racism because he's darker than the other human characters, and they might have been trying to evoke a Middle Eastern ethnicity. Pinocchio whistles and screams for Jiminy, but Jiminy doesn't hear. What was the whole point of that give a little whistle song? Eventually, Jiminy shows up to bid him farewell and sees him in trouble. He tries to pick the lock but can't help him. Geppetto goes to look for Pinocchio but just misses him. When they're at their weakest, the Blue Fairy shows up to help them. In this way, she is a deus ex machina in the classic sense. She is a holy figure there to help them when they're at their weakest. Like with the eagles in Lord of the Rings, she symbolizes God coming to help you at your lowest point. The super hot, sexy fairy asks what happened, and for some reason Pinocchio decides to tell a few outlandish lies, and his nose grows. In the book, this is just a visual representation of how outlandish lies are really obvious. It's not telling kids to never lie, just to only lie as is appropriate, and don't get too wacky about it. That's the kind of message I support. However, the movie distorts his nose growing into a kind of curse that gives away his lies. And the message is just that he should always tell the truth. That is a terrible message. It is often polite and necessary to lie as suits the situation.
A boy who won't be good might just as well be made of wood.
And here we have an example of Disney ageism. I really don't like this disrespect of children. Obedience is important, but so is respecting children as human beings and not robots. The Blue Fairy returns Pinocchio to normal and frees him, but warns that she will not be able to help him again, thus explaining why they don't just ride her back to Geppetto's place. They hop out of Stromboli's wagon and head back to town. Meanwhile, the swindlers have a drink with their coachman friend, who hires them to steal stupid little boys away to Pleasure Island. Even these guys who literally sold Pinocchio as a slave freak out when they hear the name. There's illegal, and then there's Pleasure Island illegal. The coachman spontaneously morphs into a devil figure as he announces that boys don't come back as boys. This terrifies the swindlers, but they're stuck in a situation where they have to do business with the coachman. He returns to normal, but he's still symbolized as the devil by his red color coding. The depiction of the devil used here may have been inspired by anti-Semitic caricatures. Compare his features to that of Wario, a Nintendo character commonly thought to be coded as Jewish. Jiminy races Pinocchio home, meaning that he's out of the picture when Honest John intercepts Pinocchio. Honest John says that he's a doctor, and he gives Pinocchio an examination and determines that he needs to go on vacation to Pleasure Island. Pinocchio lets himself be ushered away. This is presented as if it's a sin of Pinocchio's, but he's literally being preyed on by a criminal. Gideon even has a hammer to knock him out if necessary. This isn't just making a bad life decision like deciding to become an actor. This is stranger danger. And I would say this scene supports rape culture. Rape culture blames the victim for inciting the rapist and not taking necessary precautions or otherwise acting in a way to avoid the rapist attacking them. And likewise, Pinocchio is blamed for Honest John abducting him. The moralistic framework of the movie gives the viewer the takeaway that Pinocchio himself is to blame for being taken advantage of by a charismatic adult. In the movie, Pleasure Island is a fantastic threat, but a real-world case where a charismatic adult builds familiarity with a young boy to gain his trust and take him away from his father would in many cases be a child rapist. Smart Guy Season 2, Episode 19, Strangers on the Net, which aired in 1998, is about a child rapist threatening TJ and a female friend, and even though they make some bad decisions, it rightfully places all of the blame on the rapist. In 1998, Walt Disney Productions has their priorities straight. In 1940, Walt Disney blames the victim. The swindlers take him away while Jiminy chases after them. He's brought to a group of boys being taken to the island. He befriends a kid named Lampwick, who is a bad influence on him. You can tell he's bad because he says swell, spits off the wagon, and randomly snaps his slingshot with no ammunition. Pleasure Island is a trap for quote-unquote naughty boys. It presents things that bad kids would want, like a free amusement park with free food, which is hardly a Disney value. Free cigars, handed out by cigar store racist caricatures of Native Americans, free weapons to beat each other up, and an arena introduced by a racist black thug animatronic, and the opportunity to vandalize expensive stuff and generally rampage like little Nazis. It's a really ugly place. Pinocchio gets into chopping up furniture, and you can tell he's really corrupted because he says the word ain't. This is an example of classism. Words like swell and ain't were indicative of lower classes and a lack of education, which really just means a lack of authority figures imposing them with markers of upper-class socialization. Notably, Jiminy is respected as a poor person, so the film is not entirely classist, but it is with regard to Lampwick. Once the boys are thoroughly engaged in being bad, the coachman cracks a whip and orders a bunch of shadowy figures to shut the gates. The shadowy figures are never explored, but I suspect they were inspired by the original swindlers, Honest John and Gideon. In the book, they dress up as shadowy assassins to try to con Pinocchio. The film went through some major revisions, and I imagine a previous draft had the swindlers here on Pleasure Island in their shadowy assassins garb, working for the coachman. And through revision, this could have mutated into these anonymous shadowy figures enslaved to the coachman. In their current form, they feel kind of racist. It feels like they're trying to evoke black slaves. The coachman is symbolized as the devil with his red coat, but is not literally the devil as far as I know. And even if the shadowy figures were supposed to be literal demonic black apes that he somehow enslaved, it draws on artistic conventions in the depiction of black slaves.
All right now, up to it, you blokes. Come on, come on.
Lampwick and Pinocchio end up in a pool hall, drinking beer and smoking as they play. This part is funny because it's more or less exactly what the Music Man parodies with its song You Got Trouble. In The Music Man, Harold Hill needs to drum up controversy in order to sell band supplies. There's nothing controversial in town, so he creates controversy from something utterly innocent, the new pool table. He gets on a soapbox and sings about how young boys will turn delinquent because of pool. The whole thing is a satire of moral outrage, but Walt Disney was so conservative in 1940 that he presented the same basic thing as a real trouble, right there in your city, that starts with T and rhymes with P and that stands for Pinocchio. It's ironic because Walt Disney was an infamous chain smoker himself, a fact he tried to hide from the public. It's a case of do what I say, not what I do. Not to say that he can't have regretted getting into smoking and want to dissuade kids from it, but it is a particularly condescending way to send that message. You could say he was making a jackass of himself. Jiminy shows up and yells at the boys. Lampwick fights with him. Pinocchio calls Lampwick his friend, and this makes Jiminy quit. He walks off and then sees what the Pleasure Island operation truly is. The boys act badly, making figurative jackasses of themselves, and then they literally turn into donkeys. The coachman then sells them to the salt mines or the circus. This scene is truly scary. It really emphasizes the helplessness of what amounts to slavery. Pleasure Island is like Stromboli turned up to 11. While not racist in itself, this represents an instance of an overall trend in storytelling to depict slavery and other crimes against humanity that white people subjected on people of color, depicted in a fantastic scenario with white people as the sufferers. Jiminy goes to save Pinocchio. It's too late for Lampwick, who undergoes a horrific transformation, but Pinocchio gives up drinking and smoking when he sees the change, and Jiminy is able to get him off the island before he fully transforms. Now he's a living wooden puppet with flesh and blood, donkey ears, and tail. Try wrapping your head around that. Pinocchio swims to shore, and they go to see Geppetto, but find his house long abandoned. Is that an angelic dove of some sort? It delivers a message explaining that Geppetto went searching for Pinocchio, but got swallowed by a whale named Monstro. He's alive, but trapped in Monstro's belly. Making his first responsible decision, Pinocchio goes to rescue his father. Jiminy tries to stop him, but Pinocchio is following his own conscience. Weird. Pinocchio bids him farewell, but Jiminy decides that he's more loyal to Pinocchio than he is to saving his own bacon, and goes with him to the bottom of the sea. There are some goofy misadventures with fish. Jiminy is harassed by a playful fish child. He makes a move to fight it off, and he is immediately threatened by its protective mother. At least I presume mother. There's something about the widow's peak facial markings that makes me think angry mom. The mama bear trope is a stereotype, but I don't think it's a negative one necessarily, especially when the story is centered on a family with a good single father. I'm willing to call this mama bear fish a decent female depiction. Meanwhile, Monstro sleeps at the bottom of the ocean. His belly contains a lake of seawater and sufficient oxygen to breathe, and Geppetto is shipwrecked in it. He laments to his pets that there is nothing left to eat, and they'll soon starve to death. Fortunately, the whale wakes up and starts swallowing a ton of fish. Pinocchio ends up swimming with them. He ends up going to school after all. Monstro eats them all, and Pinocchio is reunited with his family. He's cold and sneezes because Walt Disney doesn't understand how germs work. Geppetto tries to warm him and discovers the partial transformation, which horrifies him and his pets. Pinocchio starts to explain that he made a jackass of himself, but gets embarrassed. Geppetto doesn't need to know what happened, he just forgives him. Which is a good show of love, but it really wasn't Pinocchio's fault. It was the coachman and the swindlers who actively hurt him. And then Geppetto prays to God and promises to go to Nineveh. Oh, no, wrong story. Actually, Pinocchio figures out that they can make the whale sneeze and escape through his open mouth. I'm not a marine biologist, but I think there's something hinky here. It goes as planned, but Monstro is furious. They try to get away as Monstro charges, breaking their raft. Geppetto tells Pinocchio to save himself, but Pinocchio can't bear to let his father drown and pulls him to a small cove as Monstro charges again. Monstro slams into the rock as they fall into the cove. Geppetto, Figaro, Cleo, and Jiminy safely wash ashore, but Pinocchio drowns. Geppetto brings him home and lays him out on the bed. They cry over his loss. However, because Pinocchio proved himself to be brave, truthful, and unselfish, the Blue Fairy brings Pinocchio back to life and turns him into a real boy. They celebrate, and Figaro kisses Cleo in the excitement. Because this film came out as a follow-up to Snow White, which had a very similar ending, it's impossible not to compare the two. In Snow White, her body is laid out with characters weeping around her, but it has the creepy part where her body is put on display in a glass coffin because they can't bear to bury something so beautiful. It appreciates her body apart from her personhood. She is then resurrected completely outside of her power. The evil queen curses her to only be awakened by love's first kiss, and then the prince kisses the body, and she wakes up just because things worked out. Her state is passive, with people doing things to her, and she has no active role in the ending. In contrast, Pinocchio's body's attractiveness doesn't enter into the equation at all. They just lay out his body because they care about the person that he was. He's not dead solely because someone took the initiative to kill him. He's dead because he selflessly saved his father from Monstro, sacrificing himself for a loved one. It is because of his active heroism that he is brought back to life. This is the masculine counterpart to Snow White. It is significantly better than Snow White, and it helps illuminate the sexism in the previous film. Jiminy sees the wishing star and goes to thank the Blue Fairy, and she awards him with a solid gold badge even though he didn't do anything. Pinocchio ignored him to join Honest John and Stromboli. His advice to have Pinocchio summon him with a whistle didn't work. He couldn't get Pinocchio out of the cage. He couldn't get Pinocchio to tell the truth. He wasn't there to warn Pinocchio away from Honest John and the coachman. He couldn't get Pinocchio to distrust Lampwick. Pinocchio finds out about the curse before he warns him. Pinocchio goes after Geppetto despite Jiminy warning him against it. And Jiminy is supposed to be a good conscience? Really? I mean, a good friend, sure, but conscience?
Oh, I think it's swell.
Careful, Jiminy. That's how you get turned into a donkey. The end. This is a weird movie. The book it came from was just a random and mean-spirited morality tale, and Disney couldn't quite clean it up as much as they needed to. Despite the sentimental singing, it's a nasty, condescending morality tale, telling kids they need to be obedient and go to school, otherwise they might as well be made of wood or turn into donkeys. I do not like the messages it puts forward. Despite being about a young boy, I feel like it's fundamentally ageist. It's for boys, but it doesn't respect boys. Pleasure Island is scary when you watch it, but it's also kind of hilariously bad when you think about it, like reading a chick tract. It's just a condescending story. Though Pinocchio is disrespected through his age and naivety, through his male gender, he does receive more respect than characters like Snow White in the previous film. With the exception of the Blue Fairy and Blink and You'll Miss the maternal characters, all of the female characters are passive, while the legions of male characters are active. And this leads us to the fundamental feminist complaint about the movie, a significant lack of female characters. Even just making the crowd of bad kids 50% female would have gone a long way for female representation in the movie. As it is, there are maternal characters and there are sex objects, and neither of them do much. Disney is racist here, though not as overtly as in some of the infamous later films. Stromboli is the only dark-skinned human. Both Stromboli and the Devil may have been inspired by anti-Semitic caricatures. There are racist caricature animatronics. The shadowy ape demons are evocative of stylized depictions of black slaves. And Monstro's body is a dark color to indicate his evil, even though sperm whales are typically light in color. And the book had him as a giant shark, not a whale. Pleasure Island also demonstrates elements of classism. Finally, there's just the overall victim blaming and lack of consequences for the villains. None of the villains receive any comeuppance. Stromboli gets filthy rich on Pinocchio's earnings, the coachman enslaves the boys turned donkeys, and Monstro is still out there to terrorize the sea. We never see what becomes of the swindlers, but they're still out there. The book actually shows the swindlers as penniless beggars, showing some consequence for the villains, but in the movie, they're presumably still out there getting rich off of other people's misfortune. The plot is more about how to avoid danger than about how to conquer it. It treats the danger as just an inevitable facet of the world, and then it blames kids who don't listen to their consciences and make jackasses of themselves. This is perhaps the worst part of it. It teaches kids to blame gullible victims and not the perpetrators actively going out and hurting people. As part of this whole Christian morality tale structure that blames people for going to hell because they don't follow the rules, instead of criticizing the whole system of damnation, and it's part of rape culture, where victims are blamed for dressing sexually and not obeying proper procedure, instead of blaming rapists for actively raping. In the real world, the coachman would be a sex trafficker, not a guy who turns kids into donkeys, and he and the swindlers need to be the ones who receive all of the blame, not Pinocchio for trusting people he thought were his friends. Honestly, just look at Smart Guy and its excellent portrayal of two kids targeted by a child molester. It blames the guy, not the kids, and it empowers kids to surf the net safely. Now look at Pinocchio, which actively blames the kid for falling for the tricks of the charismatic adult. That's shameful. Look at Smart Guy. Now back to this. Look at Smart Guy. Now back to this. This wishes it were Smart Guy. Unfortunately, it does not even smell like Smart Guy. I'm turning into a horse.